Now, I'm assuming that most, if not all of you are here for James. This is James. And James is from East Tennessee. He was born and raised in the Knoxville area. I think he has a degree from Tennessee Tech as well as the University of Tennessee. And he has a PhD. He's a mathematician, and he's really a genius. And his story is quite interesting. He is the co-creator of a website called New Discourses. And if you go there, there's all kinds of learning materials that you might want to use after this class. And he also has books he's co-authored. And James sort of became famous after he and two other academics decided that there was a lot of things being published that were not in academia, that you could get garbage published. And so he decided to test the theory that you could actually get garbage published, and they submitted 20 fake articles using buzzwords to academic journals, and 7, I believe, got published, and maybe 6 were under review before they made it public that it was all a hoax. And so they associated with grievance studies, and he has a book that's co-authored with Helen Pluckrose for people, you know, that really love academia, and you're interested in political science and philosophy, called Cynical Theories. And I would highly recommend that for people that like to read on a deep level. And James has become famous all over the world. He's going to be in Japan. You notice he shook his head yes. He's going to be in Japan next week, and he's been, the last time I saw him, he was going to some country, and he has worldwide status. And this is a local boy, Tennessean, that's turning the world upside down. And so for the next 90 minutes or so, you'll be listening to James. We will break for lunch, 30-minute lunch, and then you have to listen to me. And I'm old, and so I'll talk about the 1960s, and I'm going to talk about DEI and CRT. James.
Thank you, Carol. Probably should have did this earlier. Hey, everything she said that's good is true. Yeah, I am a local boy, so I understand that the Vols are playing. I don't care. I grew up, I called it in the Big Orange Shadow, if that tells you anything. But yeah, I am from East Tennessee, born and raised, and so I'm always excited to get to do something in Tennessee. I spent the week in northern Idaho. I'm going to Japan on Monday, really early in the morning on Monday. So it's a thrill to be here and get to do this. I'm not going to waste time with introduction stuff because I'm looking at the clock and it's oppressing me. This is an oppressor story. The clock is oppressing me because I have a lot to say. I want to give a thorough historical overview and conceptual overview of cultural Marxism. And there's a couple of housekeeping items I got to get out of the way. The first of all is that this is an overview. Okay, so I want you to understand that I'm going to break this into 4 sections, and each of the 4 sections shouldn't just be a college class, it should be an entire semester course. And then each of the subjects within actually could go on to be seminar courses in more depth. Each of the characters or concepts could actually have an entire college, not class, but semester-long course or year-long sequence dedicated to them. So this is going to be an overview. I'm not going to make it too heavy. But if you're familiar with my work already, you'll have heard a fair amount of this before. That's one piece of housekeeping. The second piece of housekeeping is that we're talking about cultural Marxism. So we have to get something out on the table immediately, which is that the world, the left, I should say, in the world, so the people who control how we are supposed to understand information have deemed the phrase cultural Marxism verboten. You're not allowed to talk about it. It is a conspiracy theory. In fact, it is an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory is what they allege. And what you're going to find out as I proceed is that I'm going to talk about the historical background of Marxism so that you understand kind of the big picture of what we're talking about and the historical context in which cultural Marxism came to be. Then that's my first unit. My second unit is cultural Marxism itself, which actually refers to a historical movement in thought. And I'm not doing an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, as it turns out, despite the fact that the Southern Poverty Law Center has me listed with a hate profile. And one of the reasons that they give is specifically because I talk about cultural Marxism, which they refer to as a conspiracy theory. So I'm going to not dive into what their argument is. I'm just going to tell you that there is a historical movement. And in this overview, that's just chapter 2. Then I'm going to talk about critical theory. That's the 3rd chapter, or I'm just going to refer to it as critical Marxism, actually, because that's one of the ways they refer to it. And that's the development really through the middle part of the 20th century of Marxism and Western thought. And then 4th, I'm going to talk about our present danger, which is woke Marxism. And the point is that we're talking about one continuous story here, one continuous evolution of Marxist thought here in the West. And woke Marxism is actually an extension of cultural Marxism, but cultural Marxism refers to something historically specific as well. So I hope that this will, clarify what that's about. This will be a fairly academic lecture, but we'll just dive in. We're going to talk first about Marxism in the historical context in which cultural Marxism came to be. Just so you have a point of reference. See, I never use notes, and I don't need notes, and now that I wrote some, I keep looking at them. I don't need them, but now it's a crutch and I can't put it down. This is a lesson for you. The first thing I actually want to say is that I'm not going to develop this thesis in depth. I did a lecture series in Texas recently. Courtney came to this, and I spent 2 hours on this subject, is that Marxism is in fact a religion. If you want the short, it's not a political theory, it's not an economic theory, it is a religion. It is very easy to describe and explain as a religion in tremendous depth. For those of you that are savvy to the terminology, I'm not going to break down. It is a theosophical religion, if you want that term, or if you would rather, it is continuous with the old Gnostic heresies against Christianity. It's a new version of those. That's a controversial statement. I'm not going to develop it, but I do want you to understand that what we're dealing with is a religion posing as economics and politics, which is why when you go after it as economics and politics, you don't stop it. It just keeps going. It's why they say real communism has never been tried, is because the real religion has never been realized, and all the attempts so far were failures or frauds to that religion. They were insufficiently faithful, is the reason why it hasn't been actually tried yet. And if you want the one-sentence summary of what that religion is, the religion of Marxism, I will give it to you. You've heard this before probably. It's very popular right now. It is being able to see what can be unburdened by what has been. And I mean that. Marx wrote in his 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, he wrote that men make their own history, but they don't make it under conditions that they choose. They make it with the nightmare of the past weighing on their minds. And he says that Marxism, the revolutions of the 19th century, draw their inspiration not from the past, but from a hopeful future. And so it is, in fact, being able to see what can be unburdened by the past that has been, or the historical conditions we find ourselves in. So that's the one-sentence explanation of the religion. I want to start, though, by talking with communism about the Communist Manifesto. And according to my time blocks that I've set up so we can be done by noon, I'm already out of time for this block. The Communist Manifesto, I just want to talk about 2 points out of the Communist Manifesto. The first is the first paragraph. So the way that communism operates, according to Karl Marx and Friederich Engels, writing a Communist Manifesto, 1848 is the date on that document. They say that the entire movement of history, so they claim that they have a science that understands the movement of history in the past, through the present, and into the future. And of course, the future state is communism that we're all moving toward. History has a purpose and a direction, which is to go to communism. And he says the entire movement of history is defined by the conflict of contending classes. And those contending classes, he says, can be summarized in a single word, which turns out to be 3 words: oppressor and oppressed. He has a lot of things. It's like we can summarize it in a word, and then it's a lot of words, or we can summarize it in a sentence, and then it's not a sentence. Marx is funny that way, but oppressor versus oppressed is the beating heart of Marxism in practice, and in theory, honestly. So it is a religion based off of the idea that there's an oppressor class and an oppressed class. And what Marx says is that once you enter into this circumstance, once you realize that this is a circumstance, that all of history moves according to the contention of antagonistic classes, he says there are only 2 possible outcomes. One of them is not maintaining the status quo. That is not on the table. History is inexorably moving. It is inevitable that we will go from stage to stage to stage in history. He says there are two possible outcomes, which is the common ruin of the contending classes or a revolutionary reorganization of the society in which they are. So there's either going to be a revolution that gives us socialism, or everything gets destroyed. Those are the only two options according to Marxists. So once Marxists start agitating a society, that's the risk that you run. They're either going to get their way or burn everything down trying, and that is their mentality. Again, that's not an economic or political theory. That's jihad. That's a religious attack theory. That's a conquest theory. But this is the key point, is that it's oppressor versus oppressed, and the entire mindset is based off of oppressor versus oppressed. Now, we're being very abstract at the moment, and so their theory, their dialectical theory, talks about the abstract moving through its negation into a more concrete understanding. That's how they understand the world. So there's our abstract. Well, that concrete, and we'll get back to this at the end, the concrete can take many forms. We could lay out an economic theory of oppression, and then we're going to get Marxism. We could lay out a racial theory of oppression. We're going to get CRT. We could lay out a sexual theory of oppression. We're going to get queer theory. We could do it about fat status, ability status, mental health status, you name it. You can imagine it, immigration status, and you can invent a critical immigration theory, for example. And even though such a thing may or may not even be written down yet, you can spend a few minutes on your own if you understand the thinking, and you could develop the theory for yourself before they do. That's kind of how we wrote the fake papers. But famously, on Twitter at least a couple of years ago, I invented critical car theory, talking about how cars create a system of all of these problems that have to be addressed, and a lot of environmental stuff, blah, blah, blah. And actually, it's not in the academic literature, but that's actually been written about now in the popular literature extensively. And so I did predict a critical car theory. You can do it with anything you want. So this is how they think about the world, and that's what it's all about. If you can separate the society into oppressor versus oppressed, talk about an oppression dynamic that both are intrinsically involved in, the goal is then to wake up the oppressed to revolt, that's your revolutionary reconstitution of society, against the oppressor so that they can change fundamentally the conditions. Marx said that will happen by seizing the means of production. And this is, again, why it's religious. What you're seizing the means of production of is whatever that concrete concept is. So if it's economic Marxism, you're going to seize the means of economic production, because Marx's religious belief is that your economic conditions make you who you are. They shape your soul. That's called material determinism in their literature. So you actually are a product of your historical and economic conditions. So you seize the means of economic production, not to control the economy, but to control people. In other words, to shape their souls, to shape them into who they need to be, which for Marx is socialist. So we're going to, and you look at what Lenin did in Soviet Union, they seized the means of production, they seized the government, they seized the industry, and they used that with the Gulag and the re-education to try to force people to become socialist. They were going to teach them to be who they really are, which is socialists. And obviously it was a 70-year failure of catastrophic proportions in one of the most evil periods of history that we know of. And this is why, though, they have this religious theory underneath it all. So this is the first point. The second point from the Communist Manifesto comes from the second chapter. The first chapter is titled Bourgeoisie and Proletarians, and it lays out the essential conflict of the capitalist era or of the feudal era before it, or even the slavery era before that. Those are the stages of history Marx sees: primitive communism, slavery as the first form of oppression, feudalism as an evolution of oppression, capitalism as an evolution of oppression further, rooted in the ownership of private property and the secured private property rights. And then that's all going to flip over, going toward a global communism by going through a stage called socialism on the way. So there's 6 stages of history for Marx. And the Communist Manifesto's second chapter talks about private property and what needs to be done. And he summarizes in a single sentence that turns out not to be a sentence. He says communism can be summarized in a single sentence, which is abolish private property. I turned it into a sentence for him. It's the abolition of private property is what he actually wrote, which turns out to be a clause, not a sentence. And I passed high school English. And I struggle with this. So abolish private property. The reason is because if we look at this from a religious perspective, the fall of man was the introduction of private property. If I can say, I own this and you don't, and I can fundamentally exclude you from ownership, whether that takes the model of a slave where I force you at violence to do what I want and I own everything and give you just barely enough to subsist, and force you to do things, whether it's in the feudal arrangement where the lord and the serf make an agreement for protection and for labor, or whether it's in the wage slavery of capitalism where I volunteer to offer my time in exchange for money to build your product for your profit. In all of those modes, the idea of private property, he says, estranges us from who we really are, which is, of course, communists that just don't know it because we're too busy thinking about mine, to be thinking about how we could all live kumbaya happily together, as it's said, each according to his abilities and to each according to his needs, from each according to his abilities to each according to his needs. Now, as an economic theory, let's just pause for a second. From each according to his ability is actually also the organization of a capitalist system. To each according to his needs is not, and it doesn't work. Especially because you can lie about your needs. You can grift. We all know about grifting. You can be in a victim mentality. You can have an entitlement complex, maybe like Karl Marx did, very famously. And you can claim to need a lot more than you need or deserve. So in a capitalist system, it is actually from each according to his ability, to each according to the value he provides to others. And you can see how that's immediately positive in its orientation. To each according to their needs could be considered very humanitarian. It operates on a different principle, but it actually circumvents the motivational structure of human beings. We do not actually operate that way. We do not contend that that's fair, and when we enter into unfairness, what happens is what happens in every communist country that tries this: people stop working. If I'm going to have to work so somebody else can have it, I just won't work. And in fact, you can see over the last 5 years, the employment crisis in our society is shaped very much like that. It will accelerate, as the experiment showed, if they move into a universal basic income, which gives people according to their needs, rather than according to their value produced for others. So capitalism solves the problem of productivity in a very powerful way. Communism or socialism cannot. That's an important aside. But Marx says, well, let's just get rid of private property. But he's a little more subtle than that, and this will bear on our discussion of woke. His more subtle point is that we're going to get rid of something he calls bourgeois private property. So this is a common trick, right? They split a concept like private property into two forms, bourgeois and proletarian. They split democracy into bourgeois democracy, where rich people have more voice, and proletarian democracy, where the rich people are suppressed so you can hear the poor people. They split all of these ideas. There's a bourgeois state versus a proletarian state. That's why they say that the socialist state is superior, even though they claim to be anti-statist. That the bourgeois state is the evil thing that they're against, and the proletarian state is therefore a necessary evil that will get us to the promised land. And it's very important to understand all of that. So here they have split the idea of private property. There's bourgeois private property, which is the stuff that you can fundamentally exclude others from. And then there's proletarian property, which is common property or communal property, and then something that Marx, a mysterious concept Marx called individual property. So private property will be replaced by individual property. Individual property is property that you have the ability to use, even though it is owned in common by everyone. And you can see how that's probably not going to work out. Everything is, come down to the library, get the things you need, and try not to destroy them, and nobody can be held responsible when it goes wrong. You can see how it's just not going to work out. But that's the shift that he says it's all about. And this is why we can't talk about this as just a crude economic theory. We have to look at how he constructed it in his more religious writings. So in 1844, in Paris, Karl Marx wrote a series of manuscripts that he did not title. They've come to be known as the Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts. That's one title, or EPM. They've also come to be known as the Paris Manuscripts, and they've also come to be known as the 1844 manuscripts. So you know when they were, you know where they were, and you know what they are, economic and philosophic. In that, he explains the difference. He explains a lot of things, but for our purposes, the key thing he explains is the difference between crude communism and what I will call, but he doesn't call, transcendent communism. And again, that's a very religious word. I'm just going to point that out again and again as we go, by the way. Crude communism, he says, is the hatred of private property. And it doesn't work. You can actually create a commune. He looked back to Gracchus Babeuf during the French Revolution. This was before the Paris Commune, so he couldn't look at that. But he looked back at some of the communes that arose in France during the French Revolution and some that were experimented with in religious communities in Germany and under the secret societies. And he says, well, the problem is that they just hate private property. They make everybody share everything all the time. So they have no road, basically, to higher culture. They don't have a way to produce good things. Everybody has basically to do physical labor on behalf of the commune. They have to work in bad conditions and they barely scrape by. It's not very productive. And he says that the reason for that is because they're not doing it right. And I don't mean in practice. They haven't changed themselves in who they are. In other words, they're still keeping the rationality of capitalism as they move or feudalism as they move forward into a socialistic state, because they haven't elevated themselves. So the way he phrases the correct form of communism, and this is why I call it transcendent communism, is he says that communism is the positive transcendence of private property as human self-estrangement, and thus a return of man to his true human, which is to say social nature. So you are to transcend private property. It's not supposed to matter to you anymore if this is mine or yours. It's just ours, like whatever. But you still have this idea that we're going to produce for one another. And it's magic. It doesn't work. It's nonsense. But it's a transcendence. It's what later got called a qualitative change in the individual. In other words, it's being born again as a communist. It's very explicitly religious. You have to transform who you are. And what he compares it to, actually, when he's comparing against crude communism, is a marriage. He says that in a marriage, when it's properly done, there is no mine and yours, there's ours among both the married couple and actually the whole family. So in a weird sense, and I'm not being too glib, just a little glib, tiny bit of glib, communism is the idea that you're married to everybody in society. That's how it's supposed to operate. We all share as though we're in one big happy family, and I don't know what you're supposed to do about things like sibling rivalry or any of that, because that's not supposed to happen, because you've all been born again to basically have Little House on the Prairie level, community. Globally, imagine what that would be like, being married to all these people you don't even know and having to organize your life like you're married to them and like they're married to you all the time. That's what the vision is. That's the hope. That's the prayer. But it requires a qualitative change in who you are. And what we're going to find in the development of cultural Marxism is that they're fighting to figure out, how do you achieve that qualitative change? Another point about Marx, this is important for the development of cultural Marxism, is that his model of spreading communism was evangelistic. It was go among the workers and not tell them the good news. It was go among the workers and agitate. You're supposed to go make them feel the pain of the life that they live as workers. Because for Marx, the whole theory is actually that your suffering is what confers knowledge about the real conditions that you live in, that get you to understand the scientific study of history. But his big problem is the bourgeois capitalist culture prevents you from seeing that, and your own stupidity and ignorance and internalized, worker status prevent you from seeing that. You have a false consciousness of who you are and how your life should be. But most importantly, and he rants about this famously by calling religion the opium of the masses, religion dulls your senses so that you won't find revolutionary fury in your suffering, but instead what you'll find is that this is for a purpose, this is a lesson, this is, part of, you'll learn virtues like forbearance, like patience and so on. And nope, Karl wants you to be a raging, angry, furious revolutionary. And so you have to clear any palliative like religion out of the way. Opium makes you go numb to your pain. So he says that religion numbs you to the suffering of your condition, but suffering would awaken you. And so there's a big focus on suffering. Now, practically speaking, imagine that you had a religion based on rebirth or second birth by going through suffering. What would you do? Make people suffer. And then blame it on somebody else and say, see how bad you're suffering? It's their fault. You should hate them. And now you see the entire mechanism of communism. And that doesn't change as we go into cultural Marxism, but it kind of goes underground a lot. But the go among the workers evangelistic model didn't work. And that sets us up for the historical context in which cultural Marxism actually evolved. What happened in the early 1910s, so we're talking Communist Manifesto's 1948 to the 1910s, virtually nothing happens with Marxism except some agitation here and there. The Paris Commune in 1871 comes and goes. It's a failure. What a big surprise. What was that? It was Paris Chaz. You remember Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone? They set up a Chaz in Paris, and this became like their model for how everything's supposed to work. And of course, it was awful and it collapsed eventually. The historical context is that Marxism hadn't worked anywhere. Going among the workers wasn't working. And as war loomed in the 1910s, World War I, or what was called at the time the Great War, as that loomed and the things started to go sideways in Europe leading up to that, what they found was that the workers were not interested in an international workers' organization. They were interested in nationalism. They cared more about what nation they belonged to, German, Italian, British, French, than they cared about being a part of an international workers' union that was going to overthrow all the bosses. Well, what happens when you mix this rampant capitalistic, you mix this rampant nationalism with a capitalistic engine and a socialist mentality? You get fascism. And so these countries, as the war started to tip fascist. And one of the doctrines that they put forth in fascism was anti-Marxism. They were explicitly against Marxism, which created a huge problem. So the Western Marxists the cultural Marxists were trying to solve that problem. Meanwhile, Marxism didn't take off anywhere, and I'm not going to talk much about Lenin, but in the East, in Soviet Union, you had the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, the Bolshevik Party founded in 1912, and they rekindled this idea of a revolutionary socialism that would take power by force. And the only thing I really want to say about Lenin particularly is that his model was called the vanguard model, and that idea of the vanguard was that you had the most deeply academic, theoretically informed theoreticians who were going to lead the stupid peasants and proles through the revolution they weren't ready to organize for. So you had the same problem in both places. You couldn't get organization. Marx's theory of go among the workers didn't work. Lenin said, do not go among the workers, send agitation and propaganda into all classes and all levels of society to drive basically everybody crazy, and then seize power by force. And then they will shepherd people. So Lenin put himself up as the good shepherd of communism. And like I told you before, actually what he sets up is a totalitarian state to force people to become socialist. Marx called, the theory that Marx had of how that works is called socialization, or the inversion of praxis, so that the society creates historical conditions that condition who you are. So if we force people to be socialist, eventually it'll get into their DNA and they will be socialist. And kind of literally, because it's a eugenics program too, because they killed everybody who wasn't socialist, right? So people who weren't disposed to obey the totalitarian state ended up in gulag or in a mass grave somewhere, or starving or freezing to death of exposure. The destruction under Stalin of the kulaks in Ukraine in particular, called the Holodomor, stands out. This isn't about Eastern Marxism though. We will have to dip into Mao a little bit later. Western Marxism is cultural Marxism. They had a different problem. Russia was a feudal state. You could take it over by force and you could get peasants on your side by promising bread and land. Turns out the workers in the West had bread and they had very small parcels of land, and you really couldn't. You could get people who were crammed into company apartment complexes to be agitated about that, but what the Western worker wanted, because he had a vision of a life he could build for himself, was reform, not revolutionary reconstitution of society. He didn't want to join some crackpot revolution. He didn't want to overthrow his national identity that meant a lot to him. They didn't want to do that. And so you have these guys, particularly Antonio Gramsci, who's an Italian Marxist, thinking on this. He's particularly frustrated that the Italian Workers' Party simply refuses to organize, and when they show up to agitate, all they want is labor reforms. They don't want crazy long hours. They don't want abusive working conditions. They want decent places to live in a wage they can afford to buy stuff with. But that's it. And they want to be left alone. Like most people, they want to work, build a life, and be left alone to live their life with their family and whatever it is that they're interested in. This was infuriating to Antonio Gramsci, who was about 4'5" and a hunchback and kind of, I mean, we won't make comments on leftists' appearance. It's not nice. I mean, wasn't there a study that said the people who are still wearing masks are less attractive on average by a lot? I'm just saying. Or they're criminals because they don't want to be seen, right? Gramsci was upset, and so Gramsci is considered to be the father of cultural Marxism. I'll challenge that a little bit. I think there's another guy who might also deserve the title. There might need to be two fathers. That's not a comment on sexual politics. But Antonio Gramsci had this idea of cultural hegemony. What he came to the conclusion is that capitalism has a culture that goes with it. It's not merely an ideology, it has a culture. And what happens in that culture is it produces like a force field against other cultures, outsider cultures. It's exclusive to cultures, right? And remember, with property, what makes it private property is that you can exclude other people from it. So you have the same concept coming back. And this exclusion of other cultures is fundamentally the problem. And so what Gramsci said is, well, how do we fight this? How do we fight a cultural hegemony that basically keeps out views like socialism, that people don't want to become socialist? Going among the workers doesn't work. You can't go agitate. And he said, well, all right, let's take a step back. Where's culture coming from? And y'all have heard Andrew Breitbart's very famous statement that politics is downstream from culture. And well, Gramsci was asking, where does culture come from? Right? And he said, well, there are certain institutions in society that produce cultures. And those institutions, the culture-producing institutions he named 5, are family, religion, education, media, and law. And you can understand how they all work. Family, you transmit your values to your kids. Religion stabilizes the values around the family and actually is a direct morals and values instruction to push the Christian values, particularly for the West, into the next generation. And in fact, Gramsci said that socialism is precisely the religion that must overwhelm Christianity. So you know what he had a target on. So religion is one that has to be undermined or overtaken in some way. Education is very obvious. You literally teach children to be active and successful participants in the existing society and its values. Media, you fill people's heads with whatever it is that the ruling class wants them to know. And then law, you actually codify how people are supposed to live within the existing society. And so his answer was that to undermine cultural hegemony, you have to enter into the culture-producing institutions and produce what he called a counter-hegemonic view. The word that we use in our language today for counter-hegemonic view is diversity and inclusion. You have to bring in things that are diverse to the prevailing value system and make sure they are included and that there's space for them. They are accommodated. So you change the rules. You don't just let them in. You must change the rules in order to allow different values that are antithetical to your values to enter. Because remember I said earlier, abstract, negation, concrete is the basic model that they operate on. Well, you have your values like the abstract, so you have to bring in negating values. Opposite values. So when you ask yourself the question, you look at what's happening in the world, and it looks like the communists are working with the Muslims, are working with a lot of other people that are not necessarily rooted in traditional American values and certainly not Christian values. Why are they favored? Why, in fact, why Muslims? Muslims are ultra-conservative in a way. They're certainly not communist in the strict sense. They're not going to do that. They're certainly not on board with the LGBTQ program. Why are they favored? Why do you have Queers for Palestine, right? What doesn't make any sense? No, it's because they're antithetical to traditional American values. You just need outside values. Why all this emphasis on indigenous knowledges? Because those are excluded so they can bring them back in a perverted form, not their true original values, but ones that have been reinterpreted through socialism. That's called korenizatsiya in Russian. It means indigenization. It's what we call inclusion today. It was a deliberate program of Lenin and Stalin. Raznobrasia was diversity in Russian, and it was the same thing. You find differences in views, you reinterpret their plight through socialism, and then you integrate them as socialists with outsider views into the community. And Gramsci was in great contact with Lenin before he went to prison. He went to prison in 1926. Lenin died in 1926. And so Gramsci and Lenin were correspondents. Gramsci famously got in trouble by warning Lenin not to trust Stalin. They worked together even before the Russian Revolution. So he knew Lenin's thought, and that's why there's this crossover, this idea of bringing ideas like diversity and inclusion, as they were in the Soviet situation, and diversity and inclusion in the cultural Marxist or cultural hegemony situation. By the way, we are now in the actual historical cultural Marxism, because the goal is to use Marxist theory and Marxist practice to enter into culture-producing institutions and transform them from within in order to soften the ground or plow the field so that communism or socialism can grow. So this is legit cultural Marxism. This is the thing that really bears that name. And I don't know if you've noticed any, Jew stuff yet, but it's not an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory to talk about this. This is legitimately a theory of Marxist infiltration into cultural producing institutions. So Gramsci had a few other ideas. I'm looking at my notes like I need them. No, I don't need them though. I have them and I don't need them. I already said, look, cultural hegemony, 5 institutions. The last thing that he has though, look, hold on. Let's just stop distracting myself. The last thing that we're going to talk about with Gramsci. Now, Gramsci, like all Marxists, I don't know if you noticed, they write a lot. They're prolific. They never stop publishing stuff. I'm not a Marxist. Gramsci got put in prison by the fascists in 1926. He was sentenced to 20 years. The fascists said they were imprisoning him, and I quote, in order to stop his brain from working. And so he went to prison and illegally, using little pencils and little scraps of paper, wrote over 3,000 pages of communist theory that was then smuggled to Moscow upon his death in 1937. And it lurked in vaults in the communist Soviet Republic until it started to get translated in the 1960s into various other languages besides Italian and Russian. And one of those languages was done in 1970. The prison notebooks, as they're called, were translated at the University of Notre Dame. And they were translated by a man with a very curious last name, Joseph Buttigieg. He has a famous son. He has a very famous son. He's Secretary of Transportation right now, as a matter of fact. If you wonder about infiltration into, say, government as a culture-producing institution, which is actually an extension of infiltration into law, literally, Joseph Buttigieg translated Gramsci, who called for that, and then his son goes directly into a cabinet position later on. So you have that not just in theory, but in practice. But what Gramsci, and this is very important for the woke idea, what Gramsci said is that what you need, this education from without by the vanguard, he disagreed with Lenin. He said that's not going to work, especially not in this capitalist West. You're not going to be able to force these people into socialism. You're going to have to change them. You're going to have to educate them. Education of the 5 institutions was most important. But he said what you need are these things called organic intellectuals. This is a very important concept. So what's an organic intellectual? It's a worker, not somebody who went off to university for 50 years or 20 years or whatever. It's a worker who has learned enough Marxist theory to interpret his experience as a worker in Marxist terms that can relate, therefore, to the average worker instead of spouting off high theory. So it's kind of the opposite model of Lenin, who said that the most advanced theoreticians should run society. In other words, for Lenin, Harvard University faculty should run society, and for Gramsci, people with lived experience should run society. Lived experience is your experience in suffering in the oppressed underclass combined with an interpretation through Marxist theory. And that makes an organic intellectual. And once you learn that that was a Gramscian cultural Marxist plot, and we've heard lived experience so many times now, it becomes very, very clear that what we're dealing with the woke and the appeal constantly to one's lived experience, which isn't just to listen to stories, it's to listen to stories interpreted through Marxism of various lenses, and then to shut up and listen to them, as a matter of fact, and not question them, regardless of your skin color. Karl has no standing here. Being a black woman hasn't helped her one bit in standing up to the woke. She's just internalized this or, whatever that. Internalized racism, sexism. Yeah, you got false consciousness. Yeah, right. Telling the truth is false consciousness in Marxism. And so Organic intellectuals are actually the educational model that Gramsci put forth, and that's actually very relevant to how the woke operate today. There's another character I think in practical sense might be equally of high standing to Antonio Gramsci in the development of cultural Marxism. He's a Hungarian. His name is George, which is the Hungarian pronunciation of George. It's George Lukacs, and Lukacs, Lukacs, Hungarian. And I'm not even going to spell George for you. G-Y-O with an umlaut, R-G-Y. It's not Georgie. It's George. G-Y is pronounced like a J in Hungarian. Okay, so George Lukacs, he was the education minister, or I should say commissar, deputy commissar of education, I should say, in the Hungarian Soviet Republic, which lasted for 4 months in 1919 after basically the Soviets took over and the Hungarians kind of revolted and the Romanian army invaded, and the Hungarians helped the Romanian army invade and overthrew the Soviets, and they got their country back for a little while before it became a socialist bloc country later again. And he had a number of ideas. I've said this repeatedly, I've now found that it is contended, which means it's probably true, that he advanced a very radical sexual politics in schools, not unlike what we see today. That's likely to be true, but it's under contention as to whether or not they're really fighting back against that one. What's not under contention is that in 1923, he wrote a book called History and Class Consciousness. And his argument in that book, among many others, one of his key arguments for our purposes is that class consciousness, or consciousness in general, let's pause for a second. Consciousness is a religious concept. False consciousness means you're not woke to the religion. You haven't been born again. So class consciousness is educable. You teach people. You don't go among the workers and tell them, look at your suffering, wake up, wake up. You teach people to become class conscious, which later became critical conscious, which later became race conscious or queer conscious or whatever else. You teach people to be class conscious, and it happens in stages. So this is the first time anybody said that within the institution of education that you educate people to be Marxists in a deliberate, graduated fashion. In other words, here's step 1, here's step 2, here's step 3, and he lays this concept out amongst much Marxist theory that we don't have to get into, including that the proletariat's biggest challenge is at the end that it has to destroy itself as a class, which he had no answer for. Nobody knew how the proletariat was going to adopt class consciousness, overthrow the government, establish itself as a government, and then destroy itself as a class. So that was the challenge, but he leaves that open for history to solve. But he said you have to teach people in stages. First, you have to teach people that they are in a class. In other words, you need to stop thinking of yourself as an individual, and you need to start thinking of yourself in a corporate or collectivist way. Secondly, you have to understand that the classes are operating, as Marx said, antagonistically to one another. Your class is being oppressed by some other class, or is oppressing some other class, or maybe both if it's somewhere in the middle, like the petit bourgeois. You need to awaken to what your class is, and then you need to awaken to the fact that it is part of this oppressor dynamic, which is a dynamic of oppression. So it's not oppressors and oppressed. There's a dynamic of oppression and oppressed that everybody's participating in. If you are oppressed, therefore you are actually a participant in your own oppression. And therefore you need to do something about it. So the next stage is therefore that you are a historical agent. We call them change agents when we teach our children today. You are a historical agent who can make history move, and then it's all theory for how to do it. That's class consciousness. You are now aware that you're part of a class, that class occupies a position in the oppression hierarchy, that oppression is a dynamic that you are a part of, and that dynamic is something you are therefore a participant in, and therefore that you can change. And the answer for how to deal with it is that you come into solidarity with your class to operate against the classes that are oppressing you. Or if you're in an oppressor class, you pledge your solidarity to the oppressed class through compassion and empathy and work on their behalf. So you use your privilege for the benefit of the marginalized in modern language. And so George Lukacs said that this is something you teach people. And you teach them a little bit at a time. You don't hit them with the whole thing, which will turn them off and freak them out. You lure them in, primrose path. No. I mean, you don't have to agree with all the Marxist stuff. Just look, you're in a class. There's a class structure to society. And then you get them in. This is how you bring people into cults, by the way. You don't tell them the whole story. You tell them a little bit at a time. And doesn't this kind of explain your life, that this class is actually, this other class is pushing your class around? And then you lure them in a little deeper. Well, you can't really associate with them because they're really trying to fool you into believing that the world is supposed to work this way. And on it goes. And so this was George Lukacs' of many, I think, most significant contributions into getting to the place that we are now today. I have to take a tangent now because I have to leave Marx. I know it's about Marxism. But there's another group, and I'm only going to touch on them briefly, that also believed in cultural, it's a socialist group, that also believed that the mechanism was not like what Lenin was doing of seizing control of society and forcing people. It was, in fact, cultural infiltration, cultural transformation. It's the same Gramscian counter-hegemonic model. And they believed strongly in education. They set up a school called the London School of Economics, as a matter of fact, in 1895, which stands to this day. They were incorporators at the beginning of the Labour Party in the UK and stand in that relationship still today. And they are called the Fabian Socialists. George Orwell referred to them as INGSOC, which stands for English Socialism. That's the bad guy organization, the totalitarian organization in 1984. It's called INGSOC. He was writing about the Fabian Socialists. You remember it's called 1984? The Fabian Socialists were incorporated in 1884. It was imagining a century of Fabian power rising, is what that novel is a warning about. And so the Fabian Socialists use the same model. They are not Marxist because they don't believe in a revolution at all, not in the traditional sense. They believe in infiltrating institutions and flipping them over from within by getting enough people inside to basically become controlling votes. And then after they get controlling votes, they start changing all the policies. They purge everybody they don't want, and they bring in everybody they do want, so that the institutions now work for them. This is the same basic idea that Gramsci had. I don't know that if they probably were in contact. But the problem is to say that the Fabian Society started in 1884, which is before Gramsci came into his theoretical prime in the 1910s. Just as a point of reference, since I keep bringing up that this is religious, and I said theosophical, the Fabian Society was a political offshoot of something called the Fellowship for New Life. Do I have to actually even try to explain what that's about to convince you that it was a crackpot religious organization that's like New Age spirits and crystals? Because that's what it was. In fact, it was much worse than that, and it was eugenic in its orientation. And of course, the Fabians were eugenic in their orientation. The most famous Fabians of the past would have been George Bernard Shaw, Sidney and Beatrice Webb. If you haven't had the delight of looking up George Bernard Shaw's talks on YouTube, I encourage you to look up some of his little monologues. Start with the one where go to your YouTube when you get a chance and type in George Bernard Shaw. There are an extraordinary number of people whom I wish to kill. And watch it in his own words. It's really fantastic. Watch his videos on how there's this strapping, wonderful young man doing great things in Germany named Adolf Hitler, blah, 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 blah. Not a good guy. You might like My Fair Lady. Not a good guy. Most famous Fabian socialist today is Keir Starmer. Keir Starmer is a Fabian socialist. If you wonder why Britain is doing all of these blatantly tyrannical things that they're blatantly doing right now, suppression of speech, arresting people for memes, arresting people for praying in public, it's because the Fabians actually control their government. The Fabian socialists have taken power. INGSOC is now in almost uncontestable power in the UK at present, and that's why this is happening. So they're just another model of the same thing. They're not revolutionaries, however, so they do not subscribe to all of Marx's theory. H.G. Wells was another famous Fabian, and he had a gigantic argument with Lenin about methods, and he thought Lenin to be quite a caveman, not as sophisticated as the British. The British way would work out in the end, and Lenin called the Fabians a bunch of opportunists who are capitalizing on capitalism for their own advancement and didn't believe that the 100-year plan would actually work. But this is how we got here today. Fabians have been very influential in American politics as well. They're very closely affiliated with something in Britain called the Round Table Group and the Royal Institute for International Affairs. They set up a group there in England called the Chatham House, and in the United States and New York they call it the Council for Foreign Relations. And in China, it's called the Asia Society, if you care to look into that demonic organization. So this is actually a gigantic global plot of cultural Marxist or their kissing cousin in parallel organizations. That's all I'm going to say about the Fabians. But the Fabians, one more thing is their biggest method is that they infiltrate both the right and the left. So then the right and the left have a fake argument about whatever details, and they run their agenda up the middle. And I think that's going to sound very familiar to you under the brand name Rhino here in America. So they'll have a fake media, they'll have fake politicians, and they get in huge fights that don't mean anything while the agenda goes right up the middle. Every vote that actually matters always goes to the left. And that's a Fabian strategy of infiltrate and take over and destroy. But infiltrate's the key. So if you don't think that Fabian socialism or the cultural Marxists or outright Marxists have infiltrated the right wing in the United States, you're naive at best. They certainly have and have been doing for a century and been working it against us. And we're starting to wake up to this problem with the so-called rhinos. That's cultural Marxism. We'll save questions till after lunch. Cultural Marxism didn't do a lot. I mean, you can hear how its children and grandchildren in ideological terms have done a lot. But as a single movement, it didn't achieve much. They didn't have a very effective theory of change. They didn't have a good bit of activism. So they also didn't have kind of a organizational structure behind them. The Fabian Socialists obviously did, but they did not in the cultural Marxist sense. And the cultural Marxists, therefore, spun off something called the Institute for Marxism in Frankfurt, Germany, which renamed itself very quickly the Institute for Social Research so that they didn't give themselves away. Because why? Because Marxists always lie. The Institute for Social Research is called the Frankfurt School. Colloquially, it is the birthplace of the critical theory. And so even they, not always, sometimes, refer to that school of thought, which is derivative of cultural Marxism, as critical Marxism. The critical theory that is the critical in theory in critical race theory is this. And so we're very familiar with the critical theory today. If you go get a document from your kid's school and look at it, you're going to find a critical reevaluation of this, a critical analysis of that, critical understanding, and that word is not dropped there idly. That word is there very intentionally. It means they're going to use critical theory in order to do it. Kamala Harris recently got interviewed on how this was all going to get paid for, all of her programs that she was putting forth that are basically kind of twisted versions of Trump's programs. And she needs her MAGA hat. And she said, if you recall, she said return on investment. Return on investment. The whole media made fun of her because in this like 30-second, 40-second soundbite, she said return on investment 5 times. Well, the last time she said it, she said not just that there would be return on investment, she said we need a critical reevaluation of how we measure return on investment. Boom, there it was, tucked right in. She's a Marxist. Nobody heard it. I went on the trail trying to tell people about it. I went crazy trying to tell people. Nobody could hear it. No, that's not what she means. Critical reevaluation of how return on investment is measured. In other words, there are other returns on investment, like having Marxist success in our society, tearing it apart, that are a return on their investment to implement these programs. They implement something very expensive that looks like it might be damaging. No, how are you going to pay for it? She's not worried about it being paid for. We're doing a critical reevaluation of return on investment. So what is this critical? The critical theory was developed at the Frankfurt School. I'm not going to get into the details of its foundation, which was in 1923, in collaboration with Lukacs, in collaboration with Gramsci, but it was founded by, or at least it wasn't founded necessarily by, but it was headed initially by, I think it was founded by Karl Grunberg. I'm not going to talk about him at all. One of the earlier members, I'm only going to mention a sentence about him, was Walter, I always say it wrong, Benjamin. You're going to spell it Walter Benjamin, but it's Walter Benjamin when you pronounce it in German. Walter Benjamin was a mystic, and unfortunately for the conspiracy theory side of things, he was a Jewish mystic. And he incorporated into Marxism Jewish mysticism and art on purpose. That was his contribution. So that lays at the very base of the Frankfurt School, which has led to very many things like Wikipedia labeling cultural Marxism and anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. The first major character in the Frankfurt School I want to talk about is Max Horkheimer, who became director in, I think, 1930. So 7 or 8 years in, he becomes the director. There's a little interruption in 1932. They started to get really nervous. They were in Germany. It looked like Hitler was going to take some power. In 1933, he did, so they had to leave Germany, and they went briefly to Geneva, and then on Rockefeller money and with the help of the Fabians, they were imported to United States major universities, starting at Columbia, which has been bad for a very long time, branching into Brandeis, and eventually half of them basically colonized the UC system. UCSD, UCLA ended up with a fair amount of critical Marxist representation. Max Horkheimer, after moving here to the United States, comes up with the critical theory in 1937. He explains in an interview late in his life, in the 1960s, he explained his rationale for the critical theory, which tells you all you need to know about critical theory, and it's all I'm going to say about Max Horkheimer. He said that he developed the critical theory partly because Marx was wrong. Marx believed that capitalism would immiserate the worker, and in fact, it does not immiserate the worker. He believed that capitalism would spontaneously move us into socialism when the contradictions became unbearable, but that in fact does not happen because the worker is stabilized. He said that what led him to therefore develop the critical theory was that the rationality of capitalism makes it impossible to view the ideal society, communism, in the terms of the existing society. You can't even talk about or imagine what society should look like. It's beyond our imaginary, as they phrase it. And so since it's impossible to describe the good society, the ideal society, on the terms of the present society, he concluded all we can do is criticize those elements of the society we have that we wish to change. So the critical theory is a way for leftists to engage in raw criticism. If we were going to talk in religious language, a wholly negative theology. You never talk about what God or heaven is, you merely talk about what they are not. And so you point at society and whatever it is, and you say, but look at all of this. We all have all these cars, we can get around, and you say, but they pollute the environment, and the poor people can't have them, so it's not fair, and it's going to destroy us in the end. So you just find ways to complain about everything such that the complaining advances Marxist implementation. That's the critical theory. That is, as far as I can tell, the most successful definition of the critical theory I think I've ever given. And it comes straight from Max Horkheimer's logic. If you read his initial essay, which is called Traditional and Critical Theory, that he wrote on it, it's 80-something pages, like 82 pages that I don't think says a single thing. I reread it recently, about a month and a half ago, all 80 pages, and I was looking for something I could quote to make it solid for people, and it never, not once, not a single thing that's worth quoting to tell you what's actually going on. Maybe one paragraph, and it's still really abstruse. So this was all cloaked. Remember, his logic was that the existing language even is too contaminated to tell the story. So he develops the critical theory, which is how to complain about everything to advance Marxist goals. And that's all it is. And then again, remember, that's very abstract, so you could concretize that. You could make it concrete in any domain you want. You could make it concrete in the economic domain, and that's what classical Marxism tries to do with its agitation and going among the workers. You could do it in race. You could do it in sexuality. You could do it in sex, like feminism. You could do whatever you want. It could be in any domain you want. But for the critical theorists, where they located it was in the culture of capitalism. Their target was not the Gramscian cultural institution, not until the 1970s. It was the culture of capitalism. Their belief wasn't specifically on cultural hegemony. It was that capitalism produces its own culture, and that culture is self-sustaining, and so it has to be interrupted. And the way that you were going to interrupt it with critical theory was to complain about it relentlessly in ways that advance Marxist goals, like getting people not to believe in their country or not to believe that capitalism is fair and so on, which should all feel very reminiscent. The most influential for us critical theorist, and it links to everything, is Herbert Marcuse, who really comes into prominence leading in through the 1950s, but through the 1960s in particular. Herbert Marcuse, you would spell it Marcuse, M-A-R-C-U-S-E, if you're taking notes. Herbert Marcuse was a utopian. He woke back up the idea that this impossible to envision society is possible to obtain. He said, in fact, that this ideal society is contained within the existing society, and we use the critical theory to criticize the elements, to get it to shed all of its problems so that what's left can then blossom and give us a socialism. He wrote a lot of books that we really should spend a lot of time talking about that we don't have, but I'm going to touch on them. His 1955 book was called Eros and Civilization. That's eros like erotic, and it was an attempt to incorporate the psychoanalysis of Sigmund Freud into Marxist theory. By the way, another project of the critical theory of the Institute for Social Research was to incorporate psychology and sociology, particularly the sociology of Max Weber, into Marxist theory, to understand sociology and psychology specifically in Marxist terms so that you could use them as weapons to transform society. And so in Eros and Civilization, you import the idea of Freud into Marx, and his argument effectively is the basis for the entire sexual liberation movement. Almost everything sexual liberation is downstream from Marcuse, basically saying that one of the features of the capitalist culture is to repress our libidos. The libido being sexual libido, but also our libido to dominate, our libido toward rage and anger and violence, so that that's all suppressed. And when it's suppressed, it gets redirected into productive work. If you get angry, you should go do something about it. You should go, channel it into a productive direction. You should go do something worthwhile. No. That's sublimating your libido and turning it into productive work that serves the capitalist system. And so you should actually not do that. And instead, what you should do is revel in your libidos. So sexual promiscuity and activity, but also indulging in anger and hatred and in rage. Because in his argument is, in the existing society, we should be angry. We should hate all of the problems that are caused and that define our lives. So this is not a savory character. He also says that the way back into the Garden of Eden, which I believe is a very important point to make, is through taking a second bite of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So Marx's communism, I will tell you, is, as a religious project, is the attempt to re-enter Eden on man's terms in defiance of God. And Marcuse confirms that and says the way that we do that is by taking a second bite of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, which is for him to adopt critical theory. He's also incorporating Nietzsche's idea that to elevate yourself spiritually is to remove your morals, that morals are actually narratives that keep you from expressing your true internal Superman, and that the true Superman is he who's elevated above his morality, which keeps him constrained. So that's a nasty book, very nasty book. He also says near the end that the road to higher culture lies through the right love of boys. And so if you wonder if it has to do with pedophilic blackmail to get to higher culture, yes, he's advocating that. This is their program. We live in Herbert Marcuse's world, whether you like this or not, by the way. And so then in the 1960s, he writes an incredibly important book. It's magnum opus. It's called One-Dimensional Man. I'm not going to get into the whole argument of the book. There's a few highlight points I want to give you. One is that he says that what capitalism does is it carries with it not just a culture, but he calls it a technological rationality. He's trying to say why the Soviet Union failed. And he says, well, because what Marx said is that you're going to inherit all of the stuff from capitalism and then put it to use for socialism. But the problem is that the technology itself, heavy industry, big steel factories, and so on, carry capitalist mentality with them. They make you act like a capitalist, and that's why Soviet Union turned so destructive and so much of a failure. See, it's still the capitalist's fault. And so what you actually need is a complete break and a complete reinvention of technological rationality. Technology itself should be reconstituted in order to advance socialism on socialism's terms. And guess what model has been the model that's built social credit systems? Guess what model has been the model that built social emotional learning and education tech? This is the model, that technology itself should have a socialist mentality put behind it. And then he also argues, and I think this is a very important argument, that the big problem with capitalism is that it produces false needs and too much stuff. Too many gadgets, too much plastic, and it convinces people, the culture of capitalism convinces people that they need things they don't need. So you have a proliferation of stuff and a proliferation of garbage and a proliferation of plastics and terrible things, planned obsolescence by corporations trying to make money with stuff you're just going to end up throwing away after a short time. And that this is unsustainable. And so the sustainability movement finds its Western birthplace in Herbert Marcuse's most influential work in 1964. And I'm going to skip forward in time and then back. In 1969, he completes that argument in an essay called An Essay on Liberation, where he argues that the socialist program has, in like Soviet Union, has the right ideology but fails to be able to produce. So if you could create a productive socialism, then you would be able to get that off the ground. And the capitalist model can produce, but it has the wrong ideology. And so in having the wrong ideology, it's not inclusive enough and it's not sustainable enough. So if you could create a sustainable and inclusive capitalism and a productive socialism, P.S., that's what we call China today, which is a fascist communist model that was developed by Deng Xiaoping in collaboration with our State Department, by the way. Henry Kissinger, Hillary Clinton's mentor, also Klaus Schwab's mentor, as it turns out. If you could develop those two things, then you would be on the road to an actual functional new society. And he argues what is needed, A, is a biological foundation for socialism. We never quite get away from that eugenics idea, but it's spiritual. You're supposed to have the qualitative transformational change. So you're going to force people to live in a world where they demand and need socialism to get by. Hence the dependency programs that came out saying the Great Society and moving forward. And then UBI would be the ultimate dependency program. And then he also says that the working class has been stabilized and has become counter-revolutionary, so we need a new working class. Where will we find it? He says, well, you have two bastions of energy in society. One is in the young, radicalizable students in universities, and the other is in the, as he calls them, ghetto populations, primarily referring to racial minority populations. He's clear, but he also includes sexual minorities, feminists, mentally ill, and other societal outsiders. Remember that idea of counter-hegemony is diversity, is bringing in the outsiders. So he says that's where you're going to find the base for the revolution in the second half of the 20th century. So there is the birthplace of intersectionality. And where did Herbert Marcuse get this idea, by the way? He said in an interview in the same year with a French interviewer, Pierre, I forgot his last name, Vinson or something like this. He said with him that certainly every Marxist who is not a communist of strict obedience today is a Maoist. He got it from Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong implemented the first intersectional identity politics program. Herbert Marcuse helped facilitate bringing that program to the United States, and through his student Angela Davis, I bet you might mention her at some point.
Did you also mention that essay, Repressive Tolerance?
That's where it's back in time. I'm going to go back to repressive tolerance in a second, yeah. Angela Davis was Herbert Marcuse's PhD student at UCSD. She said that she radicalized twice in her life, once under him in school and once in Palestine. So there's your marriage of those two excluded ideas. And so his idea there was we're going to build a new working class through radicalized minority populations and give them the theory that they need to become organic intellectuals by sending out the young college students and getting the young college students radicalized in schools and feeding them that idea, that interpretation of their lived experience. Now we go back in time to 1965. He wrote an essay called Repressive Tolerance. That is the two-tier Keir-Starmer justice system. That is, he defines it. He says, he's talking about repressive tolerance, and he says you have three forms of tolerance in a society. Democratic, which is basically kind of this organic, what do we tolerate and what don't we? Repressive, which is what the reactionary right wing wants. We're not going to tolerate this. You're not going to have deviance. You're not going to do that. And that he says those two are actually the same thing. And that the society itself that hasn't been liberated is actually repressive by definition. So what society will tolerate as limits is already repressive tolerance, is already right wing, and is already, literally, he says, on the road to fascism and nuclear destruction. He says that. It's a nuclear annihilation ends at the end of this road. And so he says in contrast to that, there's a third type of tolerance, which he calls liberating tolerance. And here's his definition for it, as close to word for word as I can remember the definition. Liberating tolerance, therefore, would mean extending tolerance to movements from the left and withdrawing tolerance from movements from the right. That's it. That's what we live in. He says, in fact, that it is crucial that the reactionary mind never even has the idea enter its head. Therefore, it would require withdrawal of rights and privileges at the level of word and deed, but also censorship and pre-censorship of, I guess we call them today, misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation. You don't want ideas that challenge the left-wing narrative entering into the heads of ordinary people, because he says that will end in fascism. He also says explicitly that violence is always unethical, and then he says, but since when has history ever been made in accordance with ethics? And he justifies the use of violence as a means by the left, which of course cannot be tolerated on the right. And so you see Antifa, you see Black Lives Matter, you see the censorship regime in the media, you see people getting canceled, you see people losing their platforms, losing their YouTube channels, and so on. This is all the logic of repressive tolerance. We see repressive tolerance also in permitting the students to do illegal protests and permitting illegal aliens to do illegal things, not just including their immigration, but to get away with crimes. We see this in these blue cities with Soros DAs that are allowing people to commit crimes and get off. We see it all over the place. And of course, Britain is defined by this currently, this two-tier justice system that does not favor actual British citizens, or originally British citizens. And I don't mean white people, by the way. I don't mean that. I mean people who are not recent immigrants, particularly from North Africa and the Middle East, who are Muslim. So there's a blatant repressive tolerance applied. We live in the logic of that essay. The first time I read that essay was the first time I realized I have to do what I do now. I said, we live in this essay, and this is a totalitarian document. So that's critical Marxism. I guess I should mention Counter-Revolution and Revolt. That's a Herbert Marcuse essay from 1972. That's where we have our looping back to Gramsci. That's where the long march through the institutions is now taken up as a deliberate strategy. They tried to direct assault revolution in the 1960s and 68 and 69, and it failed. And so now he says, you're going to go into the institutions, you're going to do the job, and you're going to bring your ideology with you, in particular in education at all levels. And so the 60s radicals get out of the streets and they go into the classrooms, they go into colleges of education, and you start having that infiltration into our institutions. That's when they decided they had to do the Gramsci model instead of the direct critique model, and the two, cultural Marxism and critical Marxism, fused. I mention education at all levels because none of this would be possible in any regard whatsoever. None of this would be possible if they didn't conquer the education system. Every other institution except for the family is downstream from education. Media, you go learn journalism at school, you learn to read and write at school. Almost all of them are college educated. Law, you're going to law school. Religion, you go to seminary. They can capture seminaries just like they can capture secular universities. Go look, just go look. They're almost all captured. Because why? Because if you get the seminary, then you get the pastor, and if you get the pastor, you get the clergy, and you get the laity, and if you get the laity in the churches, you get the soul of the nation. They know that. It's just like if you capture the colleges of education, which they did by 1992, then you capture the teachers, and if you get the teachers, you'll get the students, and if you get the students, you get the future of the nation. And that's been their long march through the institutions, called for explicitly. It started in 1966, actually, but it was called for explicitly by the most influential member of the so-called New Left in 1972. And that became one of his rallying cries till he died in 1979. Go into the institutions. There's a famous remark, and I forgot who made it, but it's listed on the Beautiful Trouble website, that says, dress like a Republican so you can speak like an anarchist. And that is one of their strategic programs. Dress like a Republican so you can speak like an anarchist. And that's how they operate. And this was the long march through the institutions, which was not coined by Marcuse, but was pushed by Marcuse. It was coined by a Marxist named Rudi Dutschke, who was reading Gramsci and observing Mao, and said, this is what Mao did, and it worked. This is what Gramsci advocated for. Aha, and this is how you do it in practice from China, and this is how you do it in theory from Gramsci. And then that's what they've been doing since 1970 or thereabouts. And it's 50 years, 55 years almost now, that they've been infiltrating our institutions, and they've gotten inside, just like the Fabian program, they've gotten inside the institutions and brought in what? Since 1970, diversity, equity, and inclusion. All of those terms were defined in the late 60s as they exist today. Like I said, they're also imports from Lenin. And that brings us to woke Marxism, Unit 4. And so woke Marxism gets off the ground in education and at the colleges of education. The importer of this mentality was Paulo Freire, F-R-E-I-R-E. Paulo Freire, a Brazilian Marxist who came up with a theory of education that he called education for liberation. The essential core of education for liberation is that you use academic material as an excuse to have radicalizing conversations with students. You find topics within the academic material or points that he called generative themes that are emotionally resonant, especially to negative emotions, but sometimes to hope. And then you explain to them using so we have a word problem in math that mentions kids riding in the car with his mom to the amusement park as the setup. Well, amusement parks are exciting. Let's talk about amusement parks. Who's ever been to one? And now you're talking about amusement parks. Half the class has, half the class hasn't. Now you're talking about differences in the class. Wow, that's not fair. And now you have the emotional resonance. Why is it that sometimes kids get to go and some kids don't get to go? And you prime them to give answers like, not everybody can afford it, my mom and dad won't let me. And then you get to have radicalizing political conversations around those things that were brought up by the children under a doctrine in education that's called spontaneous utterance. If a child spontaneously utters something in a class, as they call it, that the teacher can address it. And therefore, you can have radicalizing political conversations, as Freire put it, as mediators to knowledge. Use the academic material just to set up the excuse to have the conversation. And he said if you do that 17 times, then you will actually radicalize a learner. He calls it conscientize. Sounds like religion. He actually also says that in this process, educators and learners must go through their own personal Easter. They must die and be reborn on the side of the oppressed. Then he goes on to explain that the Easter of Christian practice is in fact merely a date on the calendar and commemorative rhetoric and is dead with no hope of resurrection. Those are quotes. So he's trying to replace Christianity with a Marxist liberation theology in the guise of education. And that's what Paulo Freire invented. It was imported by a American-Canadian educator named Henry Giroux, who codified it as critical pedagogy. It does exactly the same thing. The student-led classroom, aka the democratic classroom, education for liberation. It had critical race theory dragged into it by a woman named Gloria Ladson Billings in 1995. She reconstituted the exact same program. Look her up, she says it herself. Critical pedagogy gets reclassified as culturally relevant teaching. They're just hiding it so that they can get away with it. And it was developed as a worldview. Literally, that's how he describes it, by an educator downstream from both Giroux and from Freire named Joe Kincheloe, who was at McGill University in Canada until he died, I think in like 2008 or 9. And Kincheloe called it critical constructivist epistemology. Says it's a worldview, and that's a whole bunch of syllables that means woke. So woke was born in colleges of education, out of all of this intersectional stuff that came out of Marcuse, out of the old Marxist ideas, out of Paulo Freire's liberation education. That's where woke was actually born. And what is critical constructivist epistemology? Well, epistemology means theory of knowledge or knowing. We don't have to talk about that part. Critical constructivist. Critical means critical theory. Constructivist means social constructivism. So it's the fusion of the social constructivist models of the postmodernists. So we always hear that talked about in my book, Cynical Theories, that Karl mentioned. It's all about the postmodern influence. It's about social construction. Everything's a social construction. Well, there's that. But that is now going to be understood through critical theory. So what it is that everything that we encounter is socially constructed. What that means is we do not perceive the world as it is. We perceive the world according to our social position with relation to power. So if you're in a privileged or an oppressed position in some dynamic, then you're going to perceive the world differently. And that's how you're going to come to know what the world is, and that you're going to believe that it's real. And you have to apply critical theory to that so that the oppressor side is taken as inferior and the oppressed side is taken as superior in all conflicts. And you're going to advance, in fact, conflicts between those two views. And that was born in our education program. The offshoots of all of these theories together, not just from education, were critical race theory, which I've called race Marxism, which says that the fundamental oppressor versus oppressed conflict, the oppression conflict, is over matters of race, specifically white versus people of color, with a special emphasis on BIPOC, aka Black Indigenous people of color. And I think there's sometimes an and in there, and sometimes there's a comma. They don't always agree on the grammar. You have the exact same Marxist idea represented there yet again. Rather than awakening to a socialist consciousness, which is your true nature, you awaken to an anti-racist consciousness, which is your true nature. Anti-racism is defined as a lifelong commitment to an ongoing process of self-reflection, self-critique, and social activism by the now very discredited Robin DiAngelo. That is the program. But that's a religious program. It's a lifelong commitment, and it includes social activism to transform the world to awaken more anti-racists. Just like the program with socialism is to awaken more socialists. They never tell you what a racially just future looks like. They just say we don't have one because it's a critical theory. And here's all the ways that outside is racist to prove that trees are racist, the carpet is racist, the ceiling is racist, the light is racist, everything's racist. Carol's racist because she's got false consciousness. We're all racist. Everything's racist because it's a critical theory, and what it really boils down to is calling everything you want to control racist until you control it. Queer theory is the same thing in sexual politics. Some people define themselves to be normal. That's a bourgeois private property. Just like being white is bourgeois private property, has the fundamental right to exclude. Well, you're a weirdo, you're not normal, you're deviant, you actually are a sex offender with children, you're going to be excluded from things. And that is an oppressive dynamic that needs to be overthrown through queer theory politics. Same model, same program, same as CRT, same as Marxism, and we could do this for all of them. Critical pedagogy is a Marxist theory of knowledge. People have set themselves up as the holders of official knowledge illegitimately, and they exclude other forms of knowing, other ways of knowing, other knowledges, which is the inclusion model yet again. Same thing. Postmodernism, as I mentioned a minute ago, is a Marxist theory of meaning making. I'm the people who understand what the symbols and the words really mean, and your interpretation of symbols and words is illegitimate. So therefore, I get to have power over you. And postmodernism is we're going to confuse all of that and set ourselves up as the gurus who are the only people on planet Earth who know what a woman is, because you don't know. Because if a 7-year-old came in here, a 7-year-old boy came in here and said, I'm a little girl, the rule of inclusion and belonging is that we have to affirm that. But if Donald Trump stood up in front of us and said, I'm the first transgender president, they would say he's making fun of trans people. So it takes a gender theorist, not a biologist, to know who's really trans and who's not. In other words, they destroy any objective truth so that they set themselves up as gurus for the confusion that results. And it's all Marxism again and again and again in various forms to attack our culture so that they can soften our culture or confuse our culture to make way for what Gramsci said in the first place. Socialism is precisely the religion that will overwhelm Christianity. And I think that we should all take them very seriously at their words. So that's a very quick overview. It's 12, so I'll cut it here. Hour and 20 minutes of talking straight at you, so I apologize for the fire hose. A quick overview of the history and contents of cultural Marxism in its various forms. The 3 forms, if you want to create a kind of a hierarchy of them, are cultural Marxism properly, which was in the 1910s to the 1930s. And then critical Marxism, which was in the 1930s until basically the 1970s, 1980s maybe. It's hard to say when the education part flipped the table, maybe in the 90s. So you have critical Marxism then, and then in the present era we have woke Marxism, which has adopted Maoist identity politics. It's much more consciousness oriented. It's adopted liberation theology, so it's much more explicitly a kind of religious movement in a weird way. And it takes its forms in these various different identity politics domains like race, sex, gender, sexuality primarily, but also sustainability, also climate change, therefore, and we actually saw the same stuff with the pandemic. The oppressors were the awful people who wouldn't wear a mask and wouldn't get a vaccine, and the oppressed were all the people who had to be locked down by their government because those nasty, dirty other deplorables wouldn't do it right? And so you can see how they generated the oppression there in order to create a vehicle and a power. So thank you for letting me give you an overview, and Carol will talk after lunch, and then we'll do questions after that.